This video is brought to you by the Paladin Learn History app. Sparta. The year is 480 BC, and as I stand here on the flat river plain, I find myself waiting for the moment the Great Walls finally appear. I am looking for a ridgeline, a gate, or a stone tower, but there is nothing here except open ground and low roofs. Thin smoke drifts from the hearths while dogs nose around in the dirt streets, and the farm fields are stitched right up to the very edge of the houses. This is Sparta, and to the naked eye, it does not look like a fortress at all. Stay with me, because we are going to walk these lanes exactly the way the locals did, moving from the high ground down to the Eurotas River and into the training yards. Together, we will answer the big question: why would a power like this choose to stay so exposed? To understand what you are looking at, we need to pull back for a moment and get our bearings over the Eurotas Valley. Behind us, the Tegetos Range rises like a wall made by the gods, featuring dark stone and sharp lines that throw a cold shadow across the plain every morning. In front of us, the Eurotas River runs slow and brown-green as it pushes through thick reeds and silt. The air down here carries a heavy mix of river damp and wood smoke, and you can smell the wet mud, ash, and the faint, sharp tang of animal pens. Now, here is the part that usually confuses people, because Sparta is not one neat, walled city like Athens or Corinth. It is actually a cluster of 5 main villages, which ancient writers called the Obai, spread out along both sides of the river and the shallow slopes. These villages are Pitane, Messoa, Limni, and Kinosura, with Amyklai sitting a bit farther south of the core. Amyklai feels like its own world, yet it remains tied to the center by roads, cults, and political power. The exact borders between these places are fuzzy because the ground itself is messy, filled with farm plots, narrow lanes, and small rises in the dirt. This is a city that grew by knitting separate villages together over time, rather than drawing a stone circle and building inward. When you imagine Sparta, you should not picture one grand urban center with a clear beginning and end. Instead, try to picture a set of neighborhoods that each have their own little hearts, like a local well, a small shrine, or an open yard. These areas are linked by tracks that feel more like winding country roads than actual city streets. At street level, everything is narrow and practical, with packed earth under your feet instead of stone paving. You see timber posts, rough stone footings, and mud brick wherever the builders could find it. The roofs are kept low, and because the smoke does not always climb cleanly out of the roof holes, the rafters become stained black over the years. Walking through here, you hear the sounds of ordinary life very close up, like the slap of sandals on dirt or a goat bleating inside a private courtyard. You might hear a stone pestle grinding grain or someone calling out to a neighbor across a lane. You do not get the skyline people expect from a famous capital, as there is no forest of marble columns or massive wall dominating the horizon. The monuments here are often small and very old, consisting of shrines and altars that matter because of what people do there, not because they are physically huge. So, if there are no grand palaces, where exactly does the power sit in a place like this? It sits in the people, specifically in the kings and their households, and in the elders who steer every major decision. It sits in the mess groups, known as the Syssitia, where every adult citizen eats and judges his peers every single day. Power lives in the routines that pull men out of their private homes and into public life as a constant habit, rather than a special ceremony. That is why, even without a single defensive wall, this entire valley can feel incredibly controlled. It is never quiet, but it is controlled, and you often feel like you are being watched even when you are standing alone. There is also a very practical side to the choice to live without walls, because while the valley is open, the Spartans are never helpless. The surrounding mountains shape every movement into the area, and the specific roads leading in and out are the only way to move an army. Because the approach routes are well known, the entire society is built around a quick muster, where men gather fast, form up, and move out to meet an enemy. In a system like that, a stone wall can almost feel like the wrong tool for the job. A wall tells you to wait, to endure, and to hope the stone holds, but the whole point of Sparta is to meet a threat long before it ever reaches the front door. I want you to look at these villages one more time. The low buildings, the drifting smoke, and the muddy fields, and really feel the mismatch. This does not look like the beating heart of a Greek empire, but rather like a hard farming town that never bothered to dress up for guests. Sparta does not live in marble or in a famous skyline. It lives in discipline, in shared meals, and in the fear and pride pressed into a daily routine. Leaving the broad valley view behind, we are going to step down into the lanes, because the strictness of this place shows up fastest when you are close enough to smell it. First, let's step inside a house, because the gap between the Spartan myth and a Spartan room is actually quite massive. You aren't walking into gleaming stone halls or marble corridors, but instead, you find a low doorway leading to a floor of hard-packed earth beneath a roof darkened by decades of trapped wood smoke. The light enters thinly through the entrance or small gaps under the eaves, so your eyes take a moment to adjust to the dimness. You can smell the interior immediately, a thick mix of old ash, damp clay, wood smoke, and the sharp, sour edge of grain stored in the corner. Along one wall, massive ceramic storage jars sit half buried in the dirt to keep the contents cool, while a few worn tools hang from wooden pegs nearby. There is absolutely no sense of show or decoration here, as the entire space is built for pure function. It is a place to sleep, a place to eat quickly, and a spot to stash what matters before heading back outside. And outside is where you truly start to feel what the adult Spartan life runs on, because the real living room for a citizen isn't in his house at all. It's the mess. The syssitia, or these communal dining groups, are where men spend their evenings and where their social status is built or destroyed in small, ordinary moments. It isn't just about dinner, but rather a daily inspection of who you are, who is pulling their weight, and who might be slipping. You learn quickly who can take a joke and who can't. And in a city without physical walls, this social pressure is one of the main ways the community stays disciplined. Imagine the space as a simple room with wooden benches or floor mats, where oil lamps throw a soft, flickering light on clay cups and rough barley bread. The food isn't meant to impress anyone, but is instead designed to keep a man hard and ready for service. You might find black broth, barley, and small bits of meat when they are available, and the air smells of boiled fat, garlic, sour wine, and the scent of sweat that has soaked into the fabric of tunics. It is loud in a way that differs from a market, because it isn't bustling or friendly, but feels more like a room where everyone knows everyone else's business. Now, while the men are tied to these evening groups, you should look at who is actually moving through the lanes during the daylight hours. Women. They aren't hidden away here like you might expect in other Greek cities, and you will see them managing stores, directing work, or checking on the progress of the fields. Part of this is purely practical, since the men are often away training or sleeping in communal spaces, which means the household has to run without them. Over time, that responsibility adds up to something you can feel on the street, as women walk with a presence and authority that comes from being the ones who actually keep the city functioning. But the system doesn't run on citizens alone, and it only works because someone else is doing the heavy labor that citizens are forbidden from doing. Helots. You will see them in the fields first, bent over in long lines as they work the rich soil near the river where the reeds give way to plots of grain. They are the ones hauling heavy baskets, turning the stone mills, and repairing the fences, moving through the same lanes as the Spartans, but with a completely different posture. There is less eye contact and more caution in their movements, and you can feel a low, steady tension even when the scene looks calm. Sparta's food supply and the entire rhythm of these villages depend on a population controlled by force, and that fear always cuts both ways. The helots live with the constant threat of punishment, while the citizens live with the permanent threat of a bloody revolt. The result is a quiet, watchful atmosphere, like a hand always resting on the hilt of a knife, even during a perfectly normal afternoon. This is why the city feels so strict when you see it up close, not because every single second is dramatic, but because the routine itself is built to keep the lid on. You notice it in the little choices, like a boy correcting his stance when an older youth passes, or a man lowering his voice when discussing the harvest. A worker might pause when footsteps come too close and then start again, like nothing happened, because nobody wants to be the one who draws unnecessary attention. And the children grow up inside that environment right from the start. You usually hear them before you see them, the sound of bare feet on hard ground, and the sharp shout of a command that sounds half like an insult. That noise carries down these narrow lanes, bouncing off the mud brick and timber. So follow it with me toward the edge of the village. In Sparta, childhood isn't tucked away behind a closed door, but instead spills out into the open for everyone to see. As we move toward the training spaces, you'll feel the center of gravity shift away from the smoke and the quiet labor of the houses, and toward a place where the city remakes its boys in public. The lane opens up into a wider space, and the sound suddenly gets much cleaner as you hear fewer voices and more rhythmic breathing. This is the dromos, the running ground, which isn't a fancy track with markers, but just a long strip of packed earth scraped hard by years of daily drills. In the dry months, the running throws up a fine dust that sticks to your sweat, while in the winter, it turns to a cold mud that tugs at the soles of your feet. Boys move in groups here, functioning not as a class with a teacher, but as a small, intense system that polices its own members. You see the older ones first, with their shoulders set back and eyes that never wander, carrying themselves like they've learned that looking unsure is an invitation for trouble. The younger boys are noticeably thinner, with ribs showing when they twist and hair cut short to the scalp. Many have small bruises or cuts on their feet, because running barefoot over rocks and thorns isn't a special challenge here, but just a normal part of the day. What strikes you most is how little gear is actually present, as there are no piles of expensive equipment or shiny displays of wealth. A simple stick serves as a marker, and a large stone marks the place to turn around, while a patch of shade under a tree counts as the only place to rest. The primary tool is the body itself, and the only lesson is repetition, doing the same movement again and again until it looks like it belongs to you. It isn't just running, and you will often see wrestling on the edge of the ground, where two boys lock up and dig their feet into the dirt. They try to shift each other's balance with small, mean tricks, like a sudden shoulder bump or a drop of weight, fighting like they want to end the match as fast as possible. They don't wrestle to show off for the crowd, but because they know someone older is watching, and that person has very little patience for failure. Now, I have to be careful here, because a lot of what we think we know about the Agoge comes from writers who lived much later. We have names for places like the Dromos and strong descriptions of the communal upbringing, but we don't have a perfect hour-by-hour schedule of how a Spartan boy spent his day. I'm going to stick to what the physical space tells us and what the most reliable sources agree on, which is that this training was public and meant to be seen. You can feel the hunger of these boys in the way they glance at anything edible, whether it's a basket near a doorway or a fig tree on the edge of a field. The training isn't only about building muscle, but about developing total control over how you move when you are exhausted, or how you speak when you are starving. That is why the posture matters so much, with the chin level and the hands quiet, because even standing still is considered a part of the test. The mentors you see here aren't gentle, and the older youths act more like harsh foremen who are quick to punish any sign of weakness. They reward the younger boys in tiny, meaningful ways, like an approving nod or a chance to lead a drill, and the kids crave those scraps of status. Leaving the Dromos now, we can shift our perspective just a little and follow the movement of the groups toward the river. The air turns cooler as we get closer to the water, and you start to smell the scent of wet leaves and river silt again. Ahead is the Platanistas, a place named for the plane trees that surround a defined fighting zone where rough contests happen in a way that everyone understands. You can picture the massive trunks and the roots lifting the ground, with the shade cutting the heat while the river makes a steady, low sound through the reeds. This is where the training becomes more openly violent and social, And the question isn't just whether you can win, but whether you can take pain in front of people who will remember it. In Sparta, being watched by your peers is the entire point, because these boys are your audience and your judges before they become the men you stand beside in battle. When two groups square up here, it doesn't feel like a sport, but more like a controlled spill of aggression that the city seems to need. You see boys rush in to slam someone into the dirt, and then just as quickly, they pull back when an older figure steps in to stop the fight. There are hard limits here because the point isn't to create chaos, but to learn exactly where you can push without breaking the unity of the group. Hovering over all of this is the quiet truth that the Agoge doesn't actually end at the edge of the training ground, but bleeds back into every village lane. The boys you see here will walk the same paths you just walked, passing the same helot workers and eating the same shared meals for the rest of their lives. So when people ask how Sparta could stand without walls, a large part of that answer is written right here in the dirt of the practice field. But there is another layer to this city, and you can feel it even now, because some of these paths don't lead back to the houses at all. They lead to the sanctuaries. The hardest lessons in Sparta aren't only taught by older boys with hard hands, but are tied to ritual, to public testing, and to the gods who are always watching from the riverbank. Leaving the training ground behind, we drop back down toward the Eurytas, and the air changes almost instantly. It is noticeably cooler and wetter down here, filled with the scent of river mud and crushed reeds, while a soft buzz of insects hovers over the banks. The ground underfoot shifts from dry, baked dirt to something darker and springy in spots, cut by narrow channels where the water has recently moved through. This is where the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia sits, tucked close to the river rather than perched on some clean, distant hilltop. That choice of location matters because it puts the sacred space right on the edge of ordinary life, where people wash, haul, fish, and cross. You do not have to travel far to find the goddess, because you simply run into her during your daily routine. The sanctuary itself is not a giant marble showpiece, but instead consists of low walls, simple timber buildings, and a central focus that pulls the community in. The most important parts are the boundary and the crowd, creating a feeling that this is a place where everyone knows the rules and everyone is watching to see who breaks them. If we shift our perspective and stand where a local might have stood on a day of ritual, you can almost map the city's entire social system by how the people gather. Older men stand close enough to see faces, younger men try to look like they belong, and boys cluster together while pretending they are not nervous. Women are set a little apart, yet they are not absent. They are present, judging the proceedings and talking in low voices. Helot labourers linger on the far edges, moving only when told and remaining careful not to drift into the wrong space. And then there is the altar area where the offerings collect, and you would certainly smell the animal fat, wood smoke, and damp leaves. You would hear the sound of feet shuffling, and perhaps a sudden burst of laughter, followed by a sharp hush when someone important steps forward to begin. Orthia matters in Sparta because she is tied to the specific kind of control this city believes in, which is built on endurance, shame, and pride. These things do not happen in private or in your own head, but out in the open where your neighbors can measure your worth. Now, there is a famous tradition connected to this place, an ordeal for boys that later historical sources describe in particularly brutal terms. The basics of the story show up again and again, involving public testing and pain used as a kind of proof, while crowds treat the whole thing as a major civic event. But I want to be careful with the details because our clearest descriptions come from writers looking back across centuries, and there is a lot of debate about how much changed from early Sparta to the later Roman era. So here is what we can say without turning the history into a myth. Orthia functions as a pressure valve. It is a stage where the community turns discipline into something physical that you cannot talk your way out of. If you endure the trial, people remember your strength, but if you flinch, they will remember that for the rest of your life. Picture a boy stepping forward and realize he is not alone because he is surrounded by the very system that raised him. Older youth stand close by, the same ones who corrected his stance at the Dromos, alongside men who will one day vote on matters of life and death. His family is somewhere in that crowd, their faces hard to read, because showing softness would not help him in this moment. He smells the river and the smoke, and he hears the sound of the crowd shifting like wind moving through the reeds. The point here is not that Sparta enjoys suffering for its own sake, but rather that Sparta never wastes a chance to make suffering useful. They bind it to a man's reputation and make his private pain a piece of public property. If you are asking why a city without walls can hold together, this is a large part of the answer. Walls are designed to keep enemies out, but they also keep your own people in. Sparta chooses a different kind of enclosure, a social and ritual boundary where you do not need stone because shame and pride do the job better. Stand here long enough and the pattern becomes clear. The training yard makes the body obey, the mess makes the adult obey, and the sanctuary makes the whole community agree on what that obedience looks like. And all of that matters even more in 480 BC, because outside this quiet valley, the rest of the world is moving. You can feel the tension in the way people talk, using shorter sentences and casting quick glances down the road while doing more listening than speaking. The big question hanging over the riverbank right now is simple. Where are the fighting men? From Orthia, we climb just enough to see the thoroughfare that runs out of the villages and into the wider Greek world. It is not a grand road in the Roman sense, but a hard-used track rutted by carts and polished by feet, edged with thick dust in the summer and slick mud in the winter. In 480 BC, this road feels like a wire carrying urgent news directly into the heart of the valley. When a runner arrives, breathing hard and stained with salt, the people do not crowd him like a market show. Instead, they silently make space, and the message goes to the men who matter with incredible speed. This is where Sparta's split kingship stops being a historical curiosity and becomes a living, breathing thing. There are two royal lines and two separate households. Yet in a crisis, the decisions still have to come out as one single voice. This happens not because the process is neat, but because the system demands it, with the elders, custom, and religion all weighing in until the result is action framed as duty. In a place without stone walls, you do not buy time by hiding, but instead you buy time by being the first to move. The muster here is not some dramatic horn blast, but rather a scene of men peeling away from lanes and fields, as if they had been waiting for the cue their entire lives.